Hello, good evening everyone. Today we'll be talking about a special topic in Indian polity, which is not often talked about in UPSC, but nevertheless it is important and therefore we'll be discussing about it. Today's topic is constitutionalism, and to understand this particular topic, it is important that we also talk about things like constitution and what is its present scenario in present India, right? So we'll be discussing all of these in detail. For this, I will be using a slide and then we will start this discussion. Okay. So here is the slide for your ready reference. Okay. See, whenever we talk about constitutionalism, there are certain things that we need to keep in mind. Okay. But before we can easily grasp the complete essence of the topic, it is important that we understand what constitution exactly is and what are the key aspects that are important to understand constitutionalism in the very first place. Right. Then we will proceed to the talks about the elements which are included in constitutionalism, and then we will talk about the state of constitutionalism in India, and then we will summarize everything, and then we will have a question answer session, and then we will further proceed. Right. So let's start our discussion with discussion of constitution. So whenever we talk of constitution, there are several definitions. However, when we say in layman's terms or in a very simple language, the simplest definition that we can have is that constitution is often regarded as the highest law of the land, right? So this is the highest law of the land. Now, when we go with the Oxford Dictionary definition, or which is the general definition, which is present throughout, or which is considered relevant, is that a constitution is a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which state or other organizations acknowledged to be governed. Right. So the key words that we have in this definition are fundamental principles. Then we have established precedents. Next, according to which organization is acknowledged to be governed. So it's a consensus kind of thing, which where an organization agrees that it will be governed according to a document, which is nothing but a set of fundamental principles or certain laws or rules. Now, when we talk about constitution, there are two things that we also need to consider. The first is the state, okay, which is the one which is the also symbolic of government, and the other is the concept of citizens, right? So citizens are basically governed by the state or the government, and therefore the constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, somehow applies to both of these, okay, and none of them are out of the state. So if you practically see the present definition of a state, citizens are also the part of the state. And of course, in regular talks, whenever we say state, we mean the government. However, we will make this distinction for certain purpose. For this discussion, we will make this keep this distinction quite apart, right? Now, see, constitution basically does not contain only and only articles, but this is something which comes to our minds when we start talking about Indian constitution. Let's say if we say Indian constitution, what pops up into our heads are nothing but certain articles, right? So if I say fundamental rights, you will start thinking about articles 12 to 35, right? Similarly, if I talk about part 1, you will be often be thinking about articles 1 to 4, right? Similarly, so what I am trying to say is that constitution, of course, is a set of articles, right? But underlining these set of articles are a set of philosophies or ideals or ideologies, right? So let's say if we are talking about fundamental rights are not only about rights, rather they also emphasize the key ideologies that are inherent or are embedded in that part, like justice to each and everyone, equality to the citizens, okay. Similarly, you have the notion of freedom or liberty, which is inherent in part 3 itself, okay. So what I'm trying to make the point of is this, that constitution contains certain articles. However, reading between the lines, you will find out that these articles are not merely articles, rather they are basically an instrument to implement certain philosophies, certain ideologies, which are there in the constitution, which we will be calling as constitutional philosophy, right? Therefore, one can argue that when you have certain philosophies inherent in the constitution, their application in reality or in society, or how they play out in reality in society, is one more point that we need to consider. For example, merely conducting a election procedure, or let's say merely the complete exercise of electing our leaders, does not guarantee that our constitution is established. And therefore, we need to make distinction between what is procedural and what is substantive. So when I say something is procedural, one can argue that if elections are fair and free, then the task of having the elections have been achieved, and therefore a basic instrument of having democratic setup has been achieved. However, others can argue that merely making an election process free and fair does not guarantee that each and every individual is going to participate, right? For this, it is also important that the citizens who are voting also exercise their vote in general, okay, according to their conscience and not under any other influence. Now, there are other influences which are present in any democratic setup. Let's take our country's example itself, right? So it's well known that now such incidences have decreased, but it is well known that there used to be an era where there was a nexus between criminals and politicians. There was looting of looting of booth, or let's say capturing of booth. Okay, so such things used to take place. Looting of the ballot. Okay, then forced voting. Okay, voting for money, voting for alcohol. These things take place. Now, when these things take place, on the surface, it might look that the election was fair. Okay, but in reality, the actual task of conducting the election, of establishing a setup where each and every individual have their say in the democratic form of government, is missing. And therefore, I want to say that if an election is conducted, procedure has been done, and therefore procedural democracy might have been established, but substantive democracy is still missing. What is substantive democracy then? Substantive democracy then will mean that all the ideals that are enshrined in democracy, let's say the very purpose of democracy, which is inherent, or the philosophy behind this democracy, should be implemented. And only then democracy will be achieved in true sense. Right now, there are two clear distinctions, and so the terms constitution and constitutionalism comes into play. And therefore, there are certain things which are written, but they're just being written does not ensure that their philosophy is implemented. Right now, let's move to the definition of constitutionalism. Now, I have quoted from two scholars. First is Professor McElwain. Okay, so Professor McElwain is saying that constitutionalism has one essential quality. It is a legal limitation on government. It is the antithesis of arbitrary rule. It is opposite to despotic government, the government of will instead of law. Right? Now, there are keywords in this quote. Okay, these are legal limitations on government. Right? So, the very concept constitutionalism imposes a legal limitation on the government. Next, it is antithesis to arbitrary rule. Okay, so it is saying that constitutionalism somehow is antithesis to this and therefore prohibits it. Okay, so let's say we can assume it to be opposite of, let's say arbitrary rule is opposite to constitutionalism, right? Now it is also opposite to despotic government, or the government where of will instead of law. So the key point is that constitutionalism is the rule of law. Now it is not written, the term rule is missing, but basically what the author is trying to say, or Professor McElwain is trying to say, is this, that constitutionalism is nothing but rule of law. So rule of law becomes an important element into constitutionalism. Now we will discuss all the details of rule of law, but for this video, I will skip this and we won't talk in detail about rule of law, right? When we move to the next quote, in next quote, he proceeds that and he says, but the most ancient and most persistent and the most lasting of the essentials of true constitutionalism still remains what it has been almost from the beginning, the limitations of government by law. Right? So again, the emphasis is on limitation of government by law. So basically, if you can sum up, okay, so summing up, constitutionalism simply means that there should be rule of law. Okay, rule of law not just for people, rather even for the state. So nobody is above the rule of law. Okay, so basically you might feel that a government is governing, or a certain political party is governing, or certain person is acting as prime minister, but essentially all of these are acting under the rule of law, and therefore the real government or the real ruler in essence becomes the law. Okay, so there is an emphasis on the law. Okay, next I will quote one more quote that is from Carl Fredericks. Okay, so Carl Fredericks has certain opinion. Let's see it. Constitutionalism is built on the simple proposition that the government is a set of activities organized by and operated on behalf of the people, but subject to a series of restraints which attempt to ensure that the power which is needed for such governance is not abused by those who are called upon to do the governing. Right? So this is one more aspect which we need to keep in mind. In this particular thing, again, if you will look very clearly, the key ideas or the key words that are here is that government is a set of activities organized by and operated on behalf of the people. Okay, so again, the emphasis is not on the constitution, rather it is on establishing a kind of setup where people have more say, right? And this is possible only when there is certain restrictions imposed, or there are certain restrictions imposed on the governing body, so that they do not grow despotic, or they do not have unlimited access to the power, right? Now again, and this is made clear from this word, subject to a series of restraints which attempt to ensure that the power which is needed for such governance is not abused. So the basic essence is to prevent government from abusing the power, right? So these are the basic concepts behind constitutionalism, right? So let's move to the essence of constitutionalism and the constitution itself. So I have mentioned it over here. Constitutionalism thus is the set of ideologies that aim to ensure that the constitution is followed not just in words, which seeks to establish a procedural kind of setup or institutions, but also in spirit, which seeks to establish a substantive kind of institutions where the underlying philosophies are put into practice in real world, right? And therefore it can be said to be comprised of key elements. Okay, now these key elements, which we'll be discussing in short, okay, are an reflection of a liberal or modern interpretation of constitutionalism, and therefore holds true in a liberal society. And therefore the concept that we have, that we will be seeing in a short while, or the elements that we'll be talking, are the byproduct of the era of liberalization, right? And since the onset of liberalization, the very concept of constitutionalism has gone through certain changes, and we are in this era, and therefore we'll be talking about it. So let's see what are the key elements of constitutionalism. Now we have Henkin's 9 key elements of constitutionalism. Now what are these 9 key elements of constitutionalism? Government as per constitution. So Henkin is suggesting that government should always act as per the constitution. Next is sovereignty of power and sovereignty of people and democratic government. So next is sovereignty, and this sovereignty is essentially emphasized for people, and then it is also emphasized for government, right? And therefore it's a kind of let's say coexistence or sharing of power which is there, and this is sharing of power between people and government, and then there is separation of power between the organs of the government. So as we know, there are 3 organs of the government, or 3 basic functions of the government. These are legislative functions, judicial functions, and then executive functions. So Henkin is suggesting that there should be separation between all of these. So a clear separation is required. Next is constitutional review. Okay. Next is independent judiciary. Next is limited government subject to Bill of Individual Rights. Okay. Now, when we talk about limited government subject to Bill of Indivisible Rights, what it essentially means is this, that at no point government can take away the power or the privileges or the rights that people enjoy, right? So governments are restricted, and in this sense they are limited. Okay, they are limited by the notion or Bill of Rights. Next is controlling the police. Then we have civilian control of military. Next is no or limited power of government to suspend the operation of constitution or a part thereof. Okay, so what it essentially means is that any government should not be able to suspend the constitution itself. Right? So governments are withdrawing their source, their authority from the constitution. And as they draw the power, there are chances where governments can easily change the constitution. And therefore, Henkin is suggesting that there should be a proper safety measures put in place so that no government should gain access control to change the constitution itself or even to suspend it, right? So there should be minimum access to change the constitution. And to do this is to make the amendment process of the constitution quite tough, right? Next is the Indian scenario. Now, this part is something where you need to come into picture, okay, or you need to start asking questions about it, because this is something which is onto you. Now, let's say if somebody asks you to comment on the state of Indian or on the state of constitutionalism in India. In this case, you can always refer to Henkin's 9 elements and then pick each and every one of them and see is it properly working in Indian setup or not. Okay, so is the government working as per constitution? Yes, it is, and therefore I don't see any problem with that. Okay, but again, one can ask certain questions when ordinances are passed or when certain bills are passed without proper discussion. Okay, similarly, one can ask when the constitution itself is suspended in certain parts. Okay, so let's say right now it is suspended in Jammu and Kashmir. So one can keep on asking such questions. Now one can ask that, do citizens of India enjoy civilian control of the military, or is there any say of citizen of India in control of military? Okay, similarly, are police behaving in the restrained manner, or are they using excessive force? Now, this is something which you can quote. Recently, in Delhi's case, when there was riot in the wake of CAA and CPA. So first we had Citizenship Amendment Bill, and then we have Citizenship Amendment Act, and there were riots in Delhi in the wake of Act. Okay, this year itself, and one can ask or one can see that even the protesters who were students were brutally thrashed. Okay, so was police working in a controlled manner is something that we need to ask. Similarly, we are seeing that limited government subject to Bill of Rights. So do people, as people, we enjoy all the rights, or we do not enjoy all the rights? Now, when we talk about enjoyment of rights, we should also pay focus on another aspect of this, which is that even if you are enjoying, you should think about the other sections of the society. So let's say if you talk about education, merely having access to education does not mean that you are empowered with that. Okay, so the real purpose of education should be sought. And what are the key ideas, or what are the institutions which are in place, which are not in place? So this comes under question. Similarly, you can question independence of judiciary. Now, this is something which I don't feel is under threat right now. Okay, constitutional review. So of course, constitutional review is possible. Next is separation of power. So in most of the cases in our country, the setup that we have is that there is overlapping between legislative authorities and executive authorities, and it is allowed unless and until judiciary does not get overlapped with anything else or with any other functions of the government. Okay, so independent judiciary is still there, and at the same time there is separation of power, and all the three function in harmony, and therefore it's okay. So when you analyze these things, there are other key elements. Let's say you can question other aspects of these. Let's say you can ask, or one can ask easily, that what was the state of bureaucrats. So what is the state of bureaucrats right now? So right now, if you will see, there are incidences where bureaucrats come openly and they bold. Okay, they leave their job, they present themselves, or they present their idea. They are not satisfied with the government. So these things are taking place. So even if, let's say, the British era has ended, there are certain elements of the British era which might be prevalent, or I won't compare it to that extent, and I should not compare it to that extent. But still, if you will see, one can still argue that are bureaucrats really independent? Okay, so this is one question which you can use to analyze the extent of constitutionalism and its state in India. Similarly, you can look at the state of education. What is the present state of education? So such things are allowed to ask, and so you will be required to look into these things when you are writing answers for on this particular topic. And even if you are writing a topic or an answer on constitutional philosophy which is closely tied together with constitutionalism, you'll have to let's say put emphasis on all these areas. So you will have to talk about rights, you will have to talk about duties, you'll have to talk about the state of women, the state of children, the state of workers, right, and such things. And apart from that, even you will have to look at the economic aspect of these things, because economically, unless and until you are not liberated economically, you are not free in real sense. You are not independent in real sense, right? So this is something that you need to do on your part. You need to, let's say, write answers for this. Okay, so I will end this discussion with this. Okay, we will meet again tomorrow. Okay, at the same time. So we'll be meeting tomorrow at 7, and then as we will meet at 7. Okay, I will be picking up a different topic. Okay, and then we'll be discussing that topic in short. Now remember one thing, that the discussions that we are doing here right now today are just meant for demo, and therefore I am not going, or I haven't gone into much of the details. Let's say I haven't talked in detail about the rule of law and its significance in constitutionalism. Similarly, I haven't talked about federal structure and a lot of more things which are there. Apart from this, one can also argue on two different aspects of constitutionalism. One is, let's say, if you have a law which is written, okay, now you want to change it. Okay, the question arises, if you make changing quite difficult, okay, or let's say if amendment procedure of the constitution is quite difficult, even if certain laws which are not suitable for the time, government will find it difficult to change, because in our country we have a kind of opposition system. Okay, and therefore most of the bills can get let's say can get tabled but not passed, just because it is getting opposed, and it is getting opposed. We have seen this with several of recent bills and acts. So let's say the bill on GST was not passed until Congress was in the government. BJP at that time was opposing the same bill. Now, when BJP came to the power, Congress was opposing the same bill, right? And it was getting hindered. Unless and until BJP didn't get the complete majority, or let's say any party didn't get the complete majority, it was tough to pass such constitutional amendments, right? And therefore, one can argue that the essence of constitutionalism, especially protecting the amendment or making harsh these amendments, how it serves the purpose of constitutionalism. Nevertheless, we need to have faith in our system and behave in a sensible manner. Apart from that, the very spirit of constitutionalism just lies on the constitutional philosophy. And therefore, I would like to end this discussion with a quote, or with a term, with a statement that constitution is not merely a document reflecting the laws and certain articles. Rather, it also reflects the kind of dreams with which it was written by our forefathers. So our forefathers dreamt of a nation, and they dreamt it and encoded it in form of constitution. And therefore, the kind of philosophy that is inherent into it will shape the kind of constitution that we have, or will shape our future. Okay, and therefore, a firm belief in constitution, and our attempt should be to maximize our contribution so that the philosophies of Constitution can be implemented in real life, in reality. They can be implemented on grounds, okay, and each and every individual who are citizens, okay, can be benefited from these ideals. So these should not just remain ideals, rather they should get implemented. That's the complete motto of this discussion, and this is something which will not be of that importance for prelims, but it will certainly be important for you to write good answers in mains, and then it might help you if you are a PSI or optional student in even in interview. Right. With this, I will end the discussion today. See you tomorrow. Have a nice day. Take care. Bye bye.